Welcome back to Spooky Stories. And tonight I'll be reading to you from More Scary Stories for Sleepovers by Q.L. Pierce and illustrated by Bart Warburton. These may be a little bit tamer, maybe, compared to the other ones. Not that the other ones are really intense, but these were basically written for kids, but some of them are really good. So the story I'm going to read is What's the Matter with Marvin? What's the matter with Marvin? Robbie tossed uncomfortably in his bed and drifted toward wakefulness. It was hot, unbearably hot. Kicking the blankets off his legs, he rolled onto his side, took a deep breath, and began to choke uncontrollably. The room was lit with a flickering, eerie orange glow. The air scalded his throat and smoke stung his eyes. "Mom! Dad!" he cried, beating at the red-orange flames licking at the edges of his bed sheets. "Mom!" he screamed and sat upright. Wide-eyed, Robbie looked around his cool, darkened bedroom. The flames had vanished, but sweat trickled down his neck and soaked the t-shirt that he wore when he slept. Robbie had been only 6 when his parents were killed in a fire that had destroyed their home, a fire that he alone had survived. His dream brought back jumbled images of that horrible night. Unlike his nightmare, Robbie had seen no flames that night, just billows of black, choking smoke. He had felt his way slowly and painfully out of his bedroom, along the hall and down the staircase. Blinded by fumes and tears, he had tried to open the front door, but it was stuck. In a panic, Robbie had used a lamp to shatter a window and crawl from the burning house. That had probably been the cause of the short, deep scar he now carried on the left side of his chest. He didn't really know. All he knew for certain was that he was the only one who had escaped. Robbie ran his fingers over the raised scar. He could hardly remember his parents. Fire had erased everything that might remind him: pictures, cards, the baseball scrapbook he and his dad had put together. After the tragedy, he lived with his grandparents for 4 years. But recently, they had decided that he needed to be around kids his own age. They sent him to live with his Uncle Lester and cousin Marvin, whom he had met for the first time earlier that day. As he sat up in bed, he listened to the unfamiliar night sounds of his new home. Outside, a cricket sang in the moonlight, and somewhere down below, a board creaked as the old house settled. And there was something else. A very soft, whining sound was coming from just down the hall from Marvin's room. Then it abruptly stopped. Robbie leaned back and thought about his day as he waited for sleep to return. Uncle Lester had been really nice. He and Marvin had met Robbie at the train and had taken him to the local diner for the biggest, gooeyest hot fudge sundae in the world. Uncle Lester had watched him eat every bite and seemed to be very pleased. Marvin didn't say much and only had a soft drink. It gave him the hiccups, which appeared to worry Uncle Lester a lot, an awful lot. Robbie felt his eyelids growing heavy. Maybe Marvin was just nervous about all the changes. Robbie could certainly understand that. Tomorrow would be his first day at Bridgeport Elementary School. Strange as his cousin was, Robbie was glad that Marvin would be with him. He drifted off to sleep with the slightest smell of phantom smoke still in his nostrils. The next morning, Robbie was very excited as he dressed and hurried downstairs for breakfast. Uncle Lester had prepared toast and scrambled eggs for him and poured a large glass of freshly squeezed orange juice. Robbie slid into his chair and smiled. "Good morning, Uncle Lester. This looks great. Thanks." "Well, you can't get through your first day at school on an empty stomach," Lester smiled and pointed to a brown paper sack on the kitchen counter. "I've made your lunch, too. Don't forget it when you go." Robbie began to munched a buttery triangle of toast, and looked at the sack. "Thanks." The older man held out a small jar of jam towards his nephew. "Here, why don't you try some of this on your toast? It's strawberry." "No, thanks. I don't really like strawberry." Lester's eyebrows raised slightly in surprise. He looked at the jar in his hand. "You don't like it?" "No, I'm sorry." For a moment Lester peered right into Robbie's eyes, then placed the jar on the table. "I thought for sure that Well, never mind." At the sound of footsteps in the hall, Robbie turned to see Marvin step into the kitchen. "Hey, Marvin, you better sit down and have some breakfast before I finish it all." Marvin glanced at the table, then to the brown bag on the counter. "I'm not hungry," he replied. "I'm leaving now." He opened the screen door and started down the steps, letting the door slam behind him. Robbie gobbled down a last bite of toast and drained his glass of juice. Quickly he gathered up his notebook and lunch bag. "Wait up, Marvin," he called, then looked over his shoulder and in. "Thanks, Uncle Lester. See you later." Lester stood and moved to the screen door. He waited for several moments, watching the two boys, then turned and began to clear the table. He picked up the jam jar and held it in his hand, studying it carefully. So, he doesn't like strawberry. A little out of breath, Robbie caught up with Marvin at the bus stop. "Hey, what's the hurry?" Marvin squinted at him as if he were trying to sort something out in his mind. But when the bus pulled up, he boarded without a word, sat in the nearest seat, and opened a book. Robbie sat beside his cousin, and they rode to school in silence. At noon, Robbie found Marvin alone on a playground bench. "Hi, Marv. Did you forget your lunch?" "My name is Marvin." Robbie sat on the bench. "Okay, I'm sorry, Marvin. Did you forget your lunch? You could share mine." "I don't eat lunch," Marvin snapped, and walked away. For a moment, Robbie stared after him. Then he felt a hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry, he's always like that." Robbie looked up and recognized the boy as one of his new classmates. "I'm Bill. I'd be happy to share your lunch. What have you got?" The two boys checked out the contents of the paper bag and were soon chatting like lifelong friends. In the shadows of a nearby corridor, Marvin gazed at them, stone-faced. After school, Marvin went straight to his room. Uncle Lester helped Robbie with his homework. Then they worked on a jigsaw puzzle together. Robbie became totally absorbed and managed to put the pieces into place one after another. He had the entire picture completed when he realized that Uncle Lester was sitting back, observing him and checking the time on a small stopwatch. "Phew," Lester whispered softly. "That's the best time yet." Robbie opened his mouth to ask what he meant, then paused. Marvin was standing at the edge of the table. With one hand, he swept the puzzle to the floor and glared at Lester. Was that fast enough? Or maybe it could use a few further adjustments. "Marvin," Uncle Lester sounded very angry, "go to your room." "What if I don't want to? What if I just stay right here and we all have a nice little talk, like about family? How about it, cousin? Don't you want to know all about your family? I'd like to tell you, but you see, I can't. I mean, I really can't. If I try, I'll just shut down again." Fists clenched, he turned to gaze bitterly at Lester. "You should tell him, you know. He shouldn't have to find out like I did. When things start going wrong. But then this couldn't happen to him, could it?" Marvin glared hatefully at Robbie. "He's too perfect." Lester raised himself out of his chair. His voice was curiously deep. "Marvin, go to your room now." The boy stood defiantly for a moment, then spun around and marched out of the room. Without a word, Uncle Lester followed. A moment later came the sound of a door closing upstairs. Picking up puzzle pieces from the floor, Robbie thought, there is something really weird going on here. What was it that Marvin wanted to tell him, and what did he mean by shut down? Was he sick? Was he jealous? Robbie crossed the fireplace to warm his hands. He looked at the collection of photos photographs framed on the mantelpiece, then realized that something wasn't quite right. All the pictures of Marvin and Lester seemed to be recent, and there wasn't a single picture of Marvin's mom. She had died a year ago in a car accident just before Uncle Lester moved to Bridgeport. Maybe it was still too difficult for them to see a reminder of her. Maybe that was why there were no photographs. But there was no pictures of Marvin as he was growing up either. Robbie made up his mind. Later, after Uncle Lester was asleep, he was going to talk to Marvin. He was going to find out once and for all what was going on. That night, Robbie tried to stay awake until he was sure that Lester had gone to bed. But sleep crept up on him, and his dream returned. In it, he was lying on the front lawn of his home. He felt the terrible heat from the fires that consumed everything in its path. He heard the shriek of a siren coming closer and closer. All at once, wide awake, Robbie sat straight up in bed. The sound stopped, but he had heard it. It wasn't part of his dream. It was a whining noise like the squeal of metal against metal. He strained to listen. Was that something being dragged across the floor? Where was the sound coming from? He slipped out of bed and tiptoed softly into the hall. Now a light tapping noise echoed down the corridor. It was coming from Marvin's room. Robbie crept closer and reached for the doorknob. He turned it slightly enough to know that it was locked. Staring at the door, Robbie stepped back. His bare foot landed right on something small, warm, and soft. The something squealed and raced down the hall. Robbie jumped, lost his balance, and fell against the door. The intruder had only been a frightened mouse. Once the commotion was over, there was no longer any sound coming from Marvin's room. Whatever was going on had stopped. He listened at the door and whispered, "Marvin, can I come in?" Silence. "Marvin, are you okay? I want to talk to you." Only silence. The next day was Saturday. Robbie was surprised when Uncle Lester explained that Marvin had gone to visit a friend nearby Riverside and would be away for the entire weekend. He claimed that he had driven Marvin over himself earlier in the morning. Robbie wasn't convinced, but he didn't ask any questions. Instead, he planned to find the answers himself. That night after dinner, Lester wanted to work on a new puzzle. "No thanks, Uncle Lester, I kind of have a stomach ache." Robbie watched Uncle Lester's eyes widen, then narrow in disbelief. "I thought I might just go to bed a little early." "All right," Lester scowled. For a moment he seemed annoyed. Then a different expression came over his face, one that frightened Robbie. It was as if he was suddenly made up his mind about something. "I suppose it wouldn't hurt both of us to get some extra rest." Once upstairs, Robbie waited in his bed. High above, a full moon sailed across the night sky. It bathed the room in ghostly light, while dark shadows crouched in the corners and resisted its glow. Once the house was silent, Robbie crawled out of bed and crept soundlessly to the stairs, edging down them carefully, one at a time. Bottom step creaked slightly under his weight. He paused, then continued on until he reached the door to Lester's study. It was ajar, and he slipped in. On the wall above his uncle's desk was a board with several hooks. Single labeled keys hung from each hook. In the moonlight, Robbie could easily read the tags: front door, shed, pickup, basement. The last two keys were not labeled. He lifted them both from their hooks and headed for the stairs. Carefully avoided the squeaky bottom step and was soon standing in front of Marvin's room. He tried the door, but it was locked. Robbie slid the first of the two keys into the lock. It turned. With a sharp click, the door opened. The room was dreadfully dark and smelled of oil and ash. Robbie had to grope along the wall as he moved inside. He He wasn't really sure what he was looking for, but he knew that something was very wrong, and this room held the clue to what that was. Strangely, there was no furniture in his way. Instead, there seemed to be some sort of metal tools hanging from hooks on the wall. When he reached the window, he realized why the room was so dark. Thick boards had been nailed up to keep out the light. His fingers touched a piece of rag that had been jammed in between the two boards, and he tugged at it. The rag slipped out, and a sliver of moonlight spilled across the floor. In its dull glow, he could see a table in the center of the room. There was something on it. He walked over and reached out to touch the object. It fell to the ground with a thump and rolled into the ribbon of moonlight. Robbie felt a scream well up in his throat. It was Marvin's head. Suddenly the room was filled with light. Robbie backed up against the wall, and when he saw Uncle Lester standing in the open doorway with a broad, flat tool in his hand. "I'm really sorry you saw this, boy," Lester growled. "I didn't come in here counting on you to be curious. That can be a good thing, but only in moderation. You're supposed to do everything in moderation. Sneaking around the house at night, that's not a good sign. But what's worse is how you lied to me. That's very bad. You didn't have a stomachache tonight." As Lester moved toward him, Robbie edged away. With a slight bump, his shoulder touched something, cool and smooth. Hesitantly, he turned and recognized Marvin's headless form propped up against the wall. Electrical wires stood out from the neck like tentacles. He peeked down at the head in the center of the room. Its sightless eyes stared at the ceiling. Wires snaked from its neck. Lester pressed closer. "Yes, Marvin is a robot. When I first made him, he seemed so perfect. I thought of everything. I invented a history for him so that the neighbors wouldn't be curious about where his mother was. Then I programmed it into his memory. No one suspected, not even Marvin, till that day that he tripped on the stairs and fell. After that, he never could eat or sleep right. I tried to fix the problem, but it just got worse. When his memory failed and he discovered the truth, well, he was only a prototype. I had always planned to just quietly replace him with a much better model. No one would be the wiser, but now you know far too much." Lester raised the bizarre tool in his hand. Robbie looked around for a way out. "Look, Uncle Lester, I won't say a thing to anyone. I just want to go back to Grandma and Grandpa's." "That's quite impossible, Robbie. You see, you never lived there. I had to provide a suitable background for you, too, so the neighbors wouldn't suspect anything when you came to live with us." "What are you talking about?" Robbie searched frantically for an escape route. "I live with my Grandma and Grandpa. They took me in after the fire." Lester smiled and moved closer. "Yes, the fire. The one that supposedly destroyed all evidence of your parents. Clever little touch, isn't it? But it was all just part of your program. Don't worry, with a few minor adjustments and the removal of recent memories, it'll be perfectly all right. You see, Marvin couldn't be repaired." He gripped Robbie by the shoulder and maneuvered the tool to the chest scar. The tool slipped in easily. Robbie felt a strange release of pressure. But then, he wasn't my greatest achievement. Robbie gaped down at the blinking lights in the now open compartment of his chest. "You are."